Welcome to Authentic Living with Roxanne, a place where we have conscious conversations about things that really matter in our lives. And now here's your host, Roxanne Derhaj.
Hi, everyone. It's Roxanne. Thanks for tuning in again this week. This week, I have Dr. Natasha Williams. Hi, Natasha. How are you today?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good, good. Natasha brings a special background with her, and I thought she would add a nice space to the podcast. She's a psychologist, and we're here with in Ontario, and she's done a variety of things. I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit about her background. She's the past chair of the board of directors of Women's Health and Women's Hands. It's a community health center for Black women and women of color in Toronto. And she's also a member of the OPA, or the Ontario Psychological Association, Canadian Psychological Association, and the APA, which is the American Psychological Association. She's currently a trainer with the Adler Graduate Institute, and she certifies in people in the CBT program. She guest facilitates with the Canadian Association of Mental Health, focusing on topics such as culturally adapting cognitive behavioral therapy for English-speaking Caribbean people, which I'm going to be very interested in talking to her about that, seeing that I'm from Trinidad. And she operates the Psychological Services, the co-director of Allied Psychological Services, where she operates an anti-oppressive private practice, looking at assessment, individual, group, and family therapy, and not family therapy, just group therapy, corporate consulting, research, supervision, and training to clients with different ethno-racial backgrounds, gender, and socio-economic backgrounds. Wow. Pretty impressive.
Thank you.
So you grew up in Dominica, which is when did you move to Canada?
So we'll go back a little bit. I'm born here in Toronto. So I'm born in
Toronto. Okay.
I'm born in Toronto. So my parents are from the Commonwealth of Dominica.
Okay.
So I have that experience in terms of being born here, but being raised as, you're Dominican. That's pretty much it.
So you have an opposite experience to me, and I think I said this to you just coming on, that I was born in Trinidad and Tobago.
Right.
Here, just when I was turning 17 to go to grade 13 and then go on to U of T.
Right.
So I am Trini, like they say.
Right.
And then coming and having to make the switch,
right.
As kind of acculturating to two cultures, coming to Canada, having traveled a fair amount prior to that, but never living anywhere else, and then starting into school immediately.
Yes. So in my family, I have that experience in regards to, we brought a cousin over in around that time. She was about 16. So I saw her transition. She lived with us. And I saw her transition from, being in the school system in the Caribbean till about a certain age. And then from there coming in, and then the systems that were put in place to allow her to transition as well into the Canadian education system. So it was a very interesting experience to witness on her end as well.
Right, because you can't wait to, like, on that Western element, right? We were exposed to a lot of things in the islands, and of course media at that time to now is different.
Yes, absolutely.
There was at least more than two channels, like we had 2 and 11, and anybody that's Trinidadians listening, yeah, and they signed off at 11 o'clock at night, and it was always news. So guess what? And then you come here, and everything is open-ended, and obviously, there was a bit of diversity, but not a lot, because I was in Mississauga, which is just outside of Toronto for people.
Right.
And at that point, there was a bit of diversity, but not a lot. And then lots of things that were different off the hop, like, their system, the academic system was a lot more lax compared to what I was accustomed to. and just,
No.
food and culture and customs, those types of things.
Now, when you came, did they put you back in a grade behind or anything like that? Because I knew that was sort of the norm back then, and they did that with my cousin as well. And the rationale for that was so that she could become accustomed to the Canadian education system. I don't know if they did the same thing with you.
They didn't with me, but my math, I was actually having a conversation with some friends on the weekend, because in the British system, which is what I grew up in Trinidad, or with our math, you just gave the answer. I had to show them the actual steps, because
Right.
they figured with these complex, kind of concepts, if you got the answer, you got the answer. Well, here they wanted to see every step, so they actually fast-tracked me back to kind of get up to the certain standards. So they made me do some, catch up so I could start showing my methods. And I was like, well, why do you need the method? And in Trinidad, when we're taking tests, we're not allowed to look left or right or backwards or forwards, because
Right.
eating, that was a very, very big norm. Here, I guess it wasn't. And I realized that quite quickly, so that people would, kind of pass answers and stuff like that, which was something that was horrifying when I kind of experienced it for the first time. So that's one of those things I went, oh my goodness, it was different. So that's one of the small things. So to kind of tell me, your path and what made you want to become a psychologist. Did you always know, and kind of, why you decided to specialize where you did?
Okay. Well, my path was interesting, to say the least. I knew when I was about 13 years old that I wanted to be a psychologist, which is strange. It means basically as soon as I got into high school, I knew. Part of it was my mother had passed away 2 weeks before I had started high school. So, and she was basically my role model. Now, she was not a psychologist, but to me, the way that she interacted with the community, with the Caribbean community, our friends and close family friends, it symbolized being a psychologist. People would go to her, look to her for advice. She was always very supportive, and always, was just very endearing, and always wanted to see people level up to the next level. So yes, we've all immigrated here. We're all in apartments at this point in time, but no, we need to own property. We need to keep on moving forward. And if you couldn't move forward right away, she would do things like sell some of her company stocks, because she would invest in company stocks. She worked at the telephone company. So if you didn't have all of your down payment for a house, she would cash some of her stocks to assist a family friend to make sure that they had the down payment for a house, so that everyone in our circles would own property, as an example. So when she passed away, I knew that I wanted to be somebody like that in the community, somebody that would be able to really be able to connect with the community. So in that respect, what I did is I decided I was going to be a psychologist. So I took all the courses that I needed to in order to be able to get to university, to be able to take the path straight. So I did a Bachelor of Arts in psychology. My master's is in counseling psychology. And then when I decided to do my doctorate, I decided I wanted a clinical doctorate, which meant that I didn't want to go through the academic stream. I just wanted to make sure that I had the skills to be a clinician. So I took a PsyD instead, and I went to the United States to complete my doctorate. And from there, what was interesting was that being a Canadian going to an American school, the training was a bit interesting. And what I noticed, especially with the cultural competency component, I found it was very, I want to say racist almost, because what they would do is a lot of the training was, this is how you work with the African American client. This is how you work with the Asian American client or the Native American client. And I had to sit back, even though I was young and a student, I really sat there and I was like, this doesn't make sense. I don't understand how you can group everybody into into a category and say that that's how you work with everybody. So it really didn't make sense to me. So when I came back to Toronto, I said, okay, you know what? I think there's more to this than the training that I received. So from there, I would start to seek out opportunities to get additional research to read, see what was out there in regards to, how to work with, and in particular, my community, because I already saw growing up that mental health and mental illness was just not spoken about at all. There was a huge stigma behind it, a lot of shame with that as well. So I wanted to really figure out, how do we then open the dialogue and be able to provide resources or information to the community that I thought that was well needed. And hence, that's where I was able to connect with the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. They had a research project that was funded by Citizenship and Immigration Canada. And that's where we were looking at, how do we culturally adapt cognitive behavioral therapy for the Caribbean community. And then what they did is they did it in different languages. So I was one of the primary therapists for the English-speaking Caribbean community. They also had it in Spanish, and then they also eventually created a manual for the Creole French-speaking community. So that's where that piece came in, and I was able to participate in that, pilot that project, be able to create a manual which was then disseminated to community, and then also facilitate training for community members that were also engaged in mental health and disseminating mental health services for the Caribbean community. And I was still, I've been training in that ever since. I've still been able to train several practitioners in the community health center settings and stuff like that. So it's been a very fulfilling way of being able to disseminate to the community. And that project also then took me to the Caribbean as well, to be able to train psychiatrists, psychologists, medical doctors at UE or in other institutes. So I've been to Trinidad, I've been to Jamaica. It looks like I might be heading to Dominica as well, to actually go back home, quote unquote, to actually disseminate some of those services there as well. So now we've been able to go to the Caribbean because they're asking for it, and I think they're hurting a lot of adversity and trauma that's been happening there, and they're looking at, we can't have mental illness under the rug anymore because our community is suffering. So it's been a great adventure, to say the least, to be able to do the work, particularly in the community.
That's amazing. Growing up in Trinidad, and remember when we had issues, they had a counselor, I'm going to call her a school counselor. And I remember, my parents had some issues in their marriage, and then you'd kind of, as a child, you're young. And I thought, oh, I'll go talk to her, whatever. She had no clue, right? It was like, go talk to your mom and dad. And I'm like, well, they're fighting. So
Right.
I can't talk to them. And that's where I kind of started to think that I realized there was if we want to go gap in service back then, and that I realized that, and then you really relied on your friends, right? Who are,
Right.
they're 12 and 13 like you too. So, you can understand the level of it. And that's where I kind of born my sense of what I wanted to become as a psychotherapist, because I recognized what I needed as a young adolescent was someone to speak to. And then if it was within the family, it's like, where you go? Like, you had nowhere to go.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of times you didn't really go anywhere because you needed to keep it within your four walls. So, I mean, even sharing it with friends was a little bit of an issue because the societal stigma was that, either you're good or you're crazy. So if you even started to even talk about any tension or mental health issues that you were going through, you would be labeled right away. So you really either kept it to yourself or you really kept it in your house. Even if you did go outside, quite possibly, a lot of times clergy, or your religious leaders were the places that you would go to for solace. So anything about, going to a therapist, a psychologist, or anything of that nature, there was no such thing. You didn't brandish your business.
Right, for sure, because that means you're telling your family business.
Business, yes.
Don't talk your family business, right? That's what they would say, right?
Absolutely.
So what I found is, well, I worked. I don't know if you probably don't know, but when I started, one of my very first jobs was I was with victim services with the Metro Toronto Police.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, when I was finished my undergrad and I was in grad school, and back then, you're quite young. I'm say 24 years old, and because I was of Caribbean descent, what they would do is, and I'll never forget these calls, because they would say, okay, because what would happen is a lot of the individuals that were of Caribbean background would not talk to anybody, that was Canadian, so they would send me in with my partner. And I'll never forget this. They sent me one, and I still have this memory in my brain. It was a family, a Caribbean, Trinidadian family. It was a murder-suicide.
Oh, I see.
And they had 6 kids, and, what, of course, at that point, it wasn't done very well. The police, because they didn't, I think, have the skill, they called us in, which we should not have been obviously reporting, but we had to talk to all children, to be able to support them, to kind of tell them, obviously we're just a bridge. We didn't do any of this. We just did the crises, at that time, and then we dodged them accordingly. But, that impact, and I'm talking back in 1990 to, it was so important, because what would happen is when I would go in, there would be a more openness. Well, she's from Trinidad, she's, quote unquote, one of us. So, she can understand culture. She can understand why this is so difficult, those types of things. So I'm just curious with what you learned. And I did my grad school in Lewiston, New York. So my diversity courses were also focused on more of the Black American identity and things like that. And I would always say, I'm Trinidadian, and my culture is mostly a Black culture, even though I'm of East Indian descent, so it's a combination.
Right.
But that is not the reality of a person that's African descent, of Caribbean descent. And they would go, well, no, what do you mean? And I'm like, it's very, very different. It's not the same. And then they would, try to understand what I was saying. And they, a lot of times the professors wouldn't get a sense of what I was explaining.
Right.
So with you, I could see what you were saying with when you were doing your doctorate. So tell me, with the Caribbean community now, what is it that you're seeing, or not just the Caribbean, but all ethnic groups? What are you seeing now out there when people are coming in corporations, people seeking mental health services, things like that?
Well, I think there's an interesting shift happening. I think that's the best way I can say it. They want more open dialogue. I think the communities, and a lot of ethnic communities, so I can branch out outside of not just the Caribbean. What I'm really finding is that they're looking for dialogue. They know that, I think generally where we're seeing that mental illness is being spoken about more. Bell Let's Talk, and a lot of these things which are opening up the dialogue. But I think what a lot of times they're noticing is that dialogue doesn't necessarily completely speak to my experience, coming from an ethnic community. But we need to have this dialogue. So what I'm finding is that we're having a lot of ethnic communities feeling more open to actually speak about mental illness, and that even generationally, I'm sort of noticing that some of the gaps are starting to decrease. So whereas it's, this generation now, I mean, I'm in my 40s, but, sort of the 20-year-olds to 30, 40-year-olds are becoming more open to actually having the dialogue, coming in for mental health services or for psychotherapy, which is a huge difference in comparison to not even wanting to come out of your home, never mind going to see someone who is as a complete stranger. But even older generations starting to even question what they've learned from beforehand and what they've understood culturally in terms of mental health and mental illness, and starting to challenge some of that, long-term ingrained thought process that they would have had in regards to what is mental illness, how does it really manifest? Is it that this person is really crazy, or there are so many factors that are coming into play when someone says that they're stressed, or that they're having difficulty, or that they're depressed, or that they're shying away from other people, or whatever the case may be. So that I find that there's more dialogue. The other thing that I'm seeing is that a lot of people in ethnic communities are so happy to see people in the profession that are also from ethnic communities.
Right.
That has been a huge thing. So a lot of times when I have people calling into the office, they are looking for, yes, not only do I want to discuss what is going on with me and discuss my mental health, but do you have somebody there that is also, African Canadian or whomever? Because I want them to also understand it's not just about depression. I want them to also understand what are some of the cultural implications, how my circumstances came to be, also from a cultural vantage point. So I don't want to teach or explain this to a therapist who is not from my background, as well-meaning as they would want to be. I need someone who possibly understands my journey, understands how I walk in this world, coming from an ethnic community. So that's why when I talk about my practice and being from an anti-oppressive framework, it goes beyond just, I treat depression, anxiety, trauma, whatever. We also have to understand some of the isms that are also in place, which also perpetuate mental illness and is also a part of it. So racism, sexism, classism, how all of these things interplay in terms of somebody's presentation. So when they are looking for somebody, they're like, yeah, listen, I really need someone who also understands how that oppression and oppressive frameworks have also contributed to my mental illness or my problems. So there is an openness. We still have a long way to go.
So it's interesting, right? Because I'm in Little Niagara Falls, and I moved here, so it was it's now becoming a bit more diverse, but it's still not.
Right.
So a lot of my clients are Canadians.
Right.
And I'll give you an example of something that because I trained, my graduate degree was back in 1994, moved here and kind of went into corporate consulting, and then went back to practice. And I remember I had a biracial person. I work with trauma, and
right.
She'd come in, and we were, I was just, supervising as a clinical supervisor, you get it. And we're talking, and she was of Chinese and Canadian descent. Visibly beautiful woman, but you could tell she was a bit Chinese, and so we were deconstructing kind of where she was at, and looking at the backgrounds and stuff like that. I had done that briefly, but the question that I was remiss in asking was, what were the cultural implications that she may have been impacted by, and how that may have impacted her self-esteem or self-worth, right, along with a lot of the other things with the trauma. And my clinical supervisor said to me, and I'm pretty astute, she goes, "Do you think about that?" And I go, "Do I?" And I said, "Not consciously." She said, "But you've got to understand your way of presenting to the world and what you bring coming from the Caribbean, having been exposed where the president and maybe, your doctor and your dentist were all a different color. You see the world in a different way." And I'm struck, right? I'm like, I'm a pretty astute person. And then she said to me, what was her reality growing up here? And I went back in, obviously next session we start to talk, and she talked a lot about bullying because she didn't look white enough and she didn't look Chinese enough, and those types of things, and how her reality was that she also had to struggle to fit, and I'm not Canadian, but I'm half Canadian, but I'm half Chinese, and those types of things. So it's interesting when you talk about, from your framework, deconstructing what that realities in someone's mind, and then how it might be presenting with the problem or the issue that they're coming with.
Absolutely.
You know, so I think very, very fascinating. Now, with people coming into corporations, I want to chat and pivot a little bit there, and tell me how if we're talking about diversity in therapy, and I'm sure, I know your practice. I'm going to assume there's several practices throughout the GTA, but I don't know, like yours.
Mhm.
What about corporations? What are they doing getting ready for the influx of what we know is, with the diversity in Canada or even in the US?
Hmm. I think the corporations, it's very interesting. I find that a lot of them aim to get ready by, um, you know, having diversity training, for example, and what does that look like? Um, but I think it's fascinating. A lot of times when you say diversity training, a lot of times it doesn't end up being, I think, as comprehensive as it needs to be. A lot of it is just, okay, very surface. Let's put it that way. So it's like, okay, be prepared. There's going to be, there's people in this, that are going to be part of our team that are going to be from all different backgrounds and religions, and we have to be encompassing and mindful of all of these, all of the different ethnic groups. I think a lot of times what corporations don't necessarily understand is that within that corporation, there's still continues to be a systemic racism that permeates through that organization, and a lot of times it is seen through microaggressions. And microaggressions meaning, a lot of the things that are being said, or some of the nuances that are being said to other people from ethnic communities, that over time become very multi-layered, like traumas. So I have a client, for example, who, for her, it was every day the little things that were being said, the spaces that she was not allowed to take. Being in an office, but basically saying that, why are you sitting here? This is you're not supposed to be meeting here, or something. So again, her feeling like that she wasn't allowed to take the same space that some of her Caucasian colleagues could take. Or if she would say anything, oh, here comes the angry Black woman. So not being able to express herself or to state her opinion for fear of, well, she's this, tall, very commanding Black woman. So she's very intimidating. So a lot of these nuances that would occur in these spaces where you then don't feel that you can be yourself. And be who you are. It's like, I cannot be my ethnic self. I have to conform to what this either European or Caucasian or Westernized paradigm is, so that I can fit in. And to do that means I cannot be my authentic self. I have to put on a mask. So that I can not only fit in, but then so that I could thrive. So where some of that difficulty lies is where a lot of corporations don't understand a lot of those underlying mechanisms that are occurring, which are then intimidating a lot of people that are working in those workplaces that are aiming to either get ahead or to actually have a space where they feel safe. There's a lack of safety that a lot of people from ethnic communities that are working in these organizations feel that they do not have, because they cannot be their authentic self. I have one client that basically says, I feel like I can't be my Black self for fear of coming across as too aggressive. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? She's like, well, if I have an opinion, I'd like to voice it. But then when I do voice that opinion, I come across as the angry Black woman. So then what I usually do is just not say anything. So that I can
very stifling, which is very stifling.
Very stifling. And I think a lot of corporations, again, don't understand that underlying foundational mechanism that I think is occurring within within organizations or corporations, which are causing your workforce to not be as productive because they're not able to bring their authentic self. Now, mind you, I'm not talking about bullying or being aggressive, literally, but if I cannot bring my authentic self or have my voice for fear of being labeled or typecasted or not being able to see as to fit, then I think your workforce cannot function at 100% because you're asking people who are from ethnic communities to conform to what you believe this either westernized or European paradigm is. And that, I think, ends up being a huge problem, which will impact productivity.
For sure. So if you're saying, we have a Eurocentric frame,
right,
so inbred and obviously has been, here since the inception of Canada,
right,
the US. So to kind of, I'll give you an example. So I married someone from Canada, and so picture this. I'm a little, town here of 7,000 people, and I show up.
yes,
I'm 22 years old, so we're talking, 30 years ago, and and then people weren't sure where to put me, and I think I may have shared this with you over lunch. They're like, "Oh, I think she's Jamaican, but she speaks really good English." And and that was the extent of it until people got to know me, and my ex-husband at the time said he overheard his mother saying, "Well, she speaks proper English." She says she's quite articulate and things like that, because it was an ignorance. And I mean, mind you, I could say once my community got to know me, I'm completely embraced here. It's a small little town, like an island that I grew up in, and I love it. Mm-hmm. But at the beginning, it was the fact that it was different, and people are afraid oftentimes of different. And and then I would say, people would say something as simple, and this is silly, but I'm like, where is Trinidad? And I'd be like, well, you know where the equator is? And and then I would say, it's the most southerly Caribbean island just above the equator, and then there's South America. Oh, because a lot of times people wouldn't know where it was, or things like that. So sometimes you're so right. It's that not knowing that people would be afraid to ask the question, like, oh, did you grow up in a normal home? I said, well, yeah, I grew up in a home like the one I live in now. Oh, okay. What was your school system like? Well, it was British. Oh, okay. It was very strict. And, and then again, so it's interesting when you say these things about microaggressions, and people don't know, and how they proceed perpetuates probably that, that whole thing of, because that person's different, that must mean they won't fit.
And then what's interesting is what a lot of people will do is try to find a category to put you in. And a lot of times that is for their comfort. It's like, okay, let me see, she looks like this, but yes, she speaks this way. Right. So, let me try and figure out what category I could put her in. But that is for their comfort and to ease their curiosity more than anything else, right? And then once I could create this category, okay, this is where we'll fit her in for now, right? Until something else comes up and you're like, oh, well, wait a minute. Again, she's quite articulate, because God forbid somebody from an ethnic community cannot speak, right? And God forbid an accent means that you are not articulate, right? You need to speak the Queen's English, to be seen as articulate. But the minute you have an accent, then all of a sudden, an accent means you're not articulate. So again, those in and of itself are then those microaggressions in regards to how close is this person to Eurocentric views or Eurocentric standards. And if they're not close enough, they're seen as different and other and not good enough.
So I'm curious, because when you're saying that this diversity training, and we've all been there in those, and we're hitting the surface. I would think, from what I've been exposed to in my corporate consulting, that surface just touches the top. And there's certain things that systemically need to be addressed for us to start having, I'm going to call it, real, authentic connection and conversations about work, right? About productivity, about being present, about being, available, but not producing at your, at 100%. So what kind of things are being suggested to companies that you see now, or what things should companies or people listening in senior management to this podcast be
Right.
thinking about looking at in reference to get themselves up on a metric to get more, I'm going to use the word culturally aware.
Right, and I appreciate that, because I know we talk about other cultural sensitivity and all of these terms, and I find that, to me, those are just buzzwords.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily describe, I think, what would possibly be needed for corporations. I think the first piece is that the corporation has to be open and willing enough to have the uncomfortable conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times the diversity training is, again, for comfort.
Yeah.
It's to actually say, look, we've had this diversity training,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But let us have the uncomfortable conversation, and that will allow us to go deeper. It's to understand how the corporation could then be perpetuating that systemic racism. What does that systemic racism look like, and how does your company possibly perpetuate that, right? Because I think a lot of times lack of awareness and ignorance is what fuels systemic racism.
And if the front facing customer is now becoming a different colored face or a different religious space, person coming in, your customer coming in is
Right.
all potentially ethnically different also.
Absolutely.
So it's like a double-edged kind of conundrum, because if, let's say, myself or you go to work into that corporation and people don't know much about us, they tiptoe around us, they make assumptions, all those things, and I'm on guard, so I'm going to be, there's going to be a lot of presenteeism because I'm going to be guarded, kind of trying to do my job. I'm not going to be productive, and your people coming into your corporation and whatever elements, they're also potentially different. How are they perceiving your front line or your middle management?
That's it. Because I think a lot of times what a lot of corporations don't realize is how they present themselves. If your, top tier or your management and everything does not represent the community that you're trying to reach out to, that in and of itself is a problem. Right. And that also speaks to the systemic racism that is going on within your company. So, I mean, it is important for them to understand how their hiring practices, how they present themselves in terms of acquiring business and that sort of thing. How does that impact their bottom line? Because we live in a diverse, society. And yes, I'm in Toronto, but that doesn't mean, Toronto's the be all end all. But Toronto, there's over 3.5, almost 4 million, individuals, widely diverse. And if you're wanting to tap into that, but also understanding that the forward face of your company is primarily Caucasian,
right?
It's not going to be helpful, and it actually will reduce your productivity, because you have people from other ethnically diverse communities that would not want to buy into your product or want to come to your or whatever the case may be. So you also have to look at what face are you presenting, as the forward face of your company. And that sometimes is the difficult discussion that they'll say, well, we hire so and such or whatever. I go, but how does your company present itself? Do I look at your not only your CEOs, but your management and whatever the case may be, and do I see ethnically diverse individuals? And I also ask a company to look at some of the terminology that they use. A lot of times we'll talk about ethnically different, and I said, different in comparison to whom?
Good point.
Right?
Yeah.
So we have to look at that, and that's why I use ethnically diverse versus ethnically different, because when we talk about difference, we're looking at something that is the norm, and everything outside of that is something different. Which means we're still putting the Eurocentric views as sort of the top or the mainstay, and everything after that has to be judged by the Eurocentric view. So I go, what terminology are you using in your materials, in sort of how you present yourself as a company, in the training that you have received? right? So a lot of that, then we have to get into the uncomfortable conversations, which a lot of times companies or organizations do not want to do. But if you're able to do that and start that discussion, you can then start to peel back. And not only peel back, I think it's just being able to unravel some of these systems that have been in place for a long time. So it's not a one conversation thing. It's something that is not going to also happen overnight as well. But as you start entering in these uncomfortable conversations, what you end up having is a place that is going to be more open to have ethnically diverse individuals and people, individuals within the organization, which means your organization will be able then to reach out to more people, which is then going to be increase your productivity. So one will beget the other, right?
So attraction, because if you think of the, the millennials coming up and, all your talent, more than likely is going to be that combination or ratio of, ethnically diverse. You will get a combination. And how are you going to attract them? And even if you do attract them, how are you going to keep them?
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
From that red end,
feeling uncomfortable in that setting, you can get me, but how do you maintain me?
Right, for sure.
How do you maintain your client, or how do you maintain your employee? If I'm not feeling safe in my workplace, I don't know how long I'm going to stay there for. And if I am staying there, how productive am I in a space where I don't feel safe or I don't feel comfortable?
Well, I think, you made a valid point that if I'm stifling as any human being, and we know this as a psychologist and a psychotherapist, that eventually that stuff has to find a way out.
Absolutely.
Right? So suppression will take forms in more arbitrations, more conflict in the workplace, more lost days, incidental absences, harassment, all those things that are the metrics that you look for. How productive are you at work? And your bottom line is going to be on the increase. And just from going for something as simple as, simple but not easy, what does it take to make every individual safe at work, regardless of what background they're coming from?
Absolutely. And again, a lot of times from a corporate viewpoint, when we talk about loss of productivity, the biggest thing that contributes to loss of productivity is mental illness. So if your workplace or your workforce is not well, anxiety, depression, those types of things, that is going to directly impact your bottom line. So it is of the utmost importance, not only to do diversity training and all of these types of things, but to address ethnic diversity within your workplace.
For sure. And I think it's, from a perspective looking at mental wellness, and I also say it's mental wellness all the way up to, potentially people that have to go off because there's definite psychiatric concerns. But really, we know that if people are more connected, they're able to recognize their stress response. If they're able to do that, they're able to internally take responsibility for what they need to take care of within themselves. If they're recognizing it's bigger than them, they go to who they need to get the appropriate support so they could stay at work.
Right.
So if all those things aren't in place, then, obviously things are going to fall down and it's going to impact, what it's costing the company just overall.
Absolutely.
So now, I know you have a course coming up, which is a bit of a pivot. So I want to just, before we step off the element on diversity, if there's any managers or even C-suite people that are listening that are thinking, how do I decide where we are? And if I could make an impact, what would be one thing that they could do, or, to be able to kind of gauge where they are as a company?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think a lot of times I think organizations pull in a lot of stats. Because you're always looking at statistics and always looking at where your company is at this point in time, how productive is the company. So a lot of times the numbers in of themselves do not lie. And if you're noticing, for example, that your company's statistics are stagnant or are not necessarily growing exponentially, there could be a clue there in regards to productivity.
Yeah.
And the culture, or checking the pulse of your department. Because is it just that, is it one-for-one numbers, or is there something going on here where you have to check the wellness of your group, of your team?
Yeah.
So a lot of times the first place to go is, and again, a lot of times managers will do this, is sort of looking at the statistics or the productivity of the company, and the productivity will speak volumes. And if it's just that, okay, is it flat? Is there actually a decline in productivity? And it's not necessarily that you have to, try to force them to do more, versus check the pulse, or how sick is the group. Is there a unwellness, for lack of a better way of saying it? Is there something that is unwell with the team that we can address a bit further? And then from there, again, stats and all of that is one thing. A lot of times, from what I have seen with some of the clients that I've worked with, there's an absolute disconnect between management and staff. Mm-hmm. And that absolute disconnect really causes, again, a lot of the lack of productivity. So a lot of it is then going to be, how do managers connect? And it's human connection. It's not just, okay, you're not meeting these numbers or whatever the case may be. A lot of it is human connection. Yeah. What is going on? How are you faring? How are you feeling? What are some of the things that you may need individually to thrive? So it's taking a pulse of your, not only just the organization, but even if we go to the management team level, being able to take that pulse, and from there, open up the dialogue to provide whatever is needed for that individual or the team, to allow the team to get well. A lot of it is like a sickness and wellness kind of. I
don't feel like metrics is like from early intervention all the way up to prevention, all the way up to keeping somebody at work, which, we know with long-term disability claims, if you don't manage people well, and the stressors, it's not always that they've had it in their family. It may be that some people have, but if people aren't able to get what they need, unfortunately, they implode somewhere.
Exactly. And I think also managers have to look at turnover.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge thing as well. And a lot of times you have to look at your statistics in terms of how many times has your team or your staff turned over. If there is a high turnover rate, you may also have to look at the culture of your team.
Yeah, for sure.
And what is contributing to that as well. And again, there in and of itself may lie some of the answers in regards to, what do I need to put in place to decrease that turnover? There's something here that is causing that. What can I put into place to not only increase productivity, but increase the wellness of that workplace environment, so that you have a lower instance of turnover?
Yeah, that makes so much sense, Natasha. Just kind of, what is your pulse? And then based on just human connection, again, you're going to get some of the answers, and then know what you need to start applying to be able to make change. And of course, change doesn't happen overnight.
Absolutely not, but it's starting to take the steps necessary.
Absolutely. So I know we need to start wrapping up, but I know you do have a course coming up. So I would like you to tell people where, what it's about, and where they can get a hold of you. I'm sure companies and executives that are listening will be quite interested in reaching out too. So if you can let them know about your website, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so that's great. So I do have a course that's coming up. It's an online course, so anybody can hop on and be able to participate. So the course is called Reclaiming Your Superwoman. and it's how to find your voice after divorce. So the reason that this course came about was part of it is sort of my personal journey as well, going through a divorce myself and having difficulty initially. How do I navigate that? But then how do I get to a space of finding my authentic voice and being able to speak my own truth in the midst of that without feeling stifled? So in regards to that, the course, again, it's online. We're going to be starting it in April, first week in April. My info is, my email is info@drnatashawilliams.com. People can feel free to reach out to me there. And from there, what I usually do is we'll book a 30-minute consultation in which we'll start to discuss a little bit more of what some of your issues are and what you would ideally like to see happen in regards to being able to reclaim your voice and being able to move forward. We look at things such as the core beliefs that a lot of women have in regards to themselves, and particularly in a relationship, and if the relationship is sort of unraveling, and what needs to happen from a clinical perspective. I also use a bit of faith as well. So it's a clinical perspective, faith, and my own personal experience that have been curated into this online course to help a woman find her voice and be able to live her own life and her own truth. No compromise. So where has a lot of this compromising come from? Where has a lot of these core beliefs and values come from? And how do we get to a space where we can start challenging that, but then also being able to, what I usually call the term, how do you become comfortable with being uncomfortable? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we run away from discomfort, and what we do is then compromise. And then we're unable to be our authentic self. So how do we get to a space in which we can then be comfortable with being uncomfortable and be able to then change the trajectory of our lives to be able to then walk in our own truth, no compromise? So I'll do a 30-minute consultation, and then from there, anyone would be able to register for the masterclass, and it's a 4-week introductory masterclass. And from there, you would then be eligible for, I do have a more intensive 3-month and 6-month program as well once you complete the introductory masterclass, and if you want to continue to work with me to continue along that journey.
Awesome. Well, what I will do for Natasha is I will include a link, so you can just check the bottom of the podcast, and there will be a link that you can just go right on. And it sounds like an amazing class, and the opportunity to work with you as a clinical psychologist with all the things that you're bringing with you, along with the faith-based element to things, having been there myself. That importance of spending that time taking care of yourself when you're going through something like this is very, very key. So again, thanks so much, Natasha, for spending your time.
Thank you so much, Roxanne, for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome. So for leaders, I want you to really think about how are you being aware of the needs of who is in front of you when in any realm. Obviously, today we're talking a bit about diversity, but just overall, how are you ensuring that you know who is in front of you and addressing what their needs are? Like Natasha said, if we feel safe at work, we are completely on, and we're going to be most productive because I feel safe and secure, and I'm just going to relish my space because all of us want to do really, really well at work. So to keep that in mind, and if that's something that's not occurring, to start to ask yourself, what is it that I need to do to get connected to the pulse of what's needed within my organization that impacts the bottom line. So again, thanks again for tuning in, and we'll chat with you soon. If you're needing more information on me, you need to go to roxannedurhodge.com, and we can connect. Take care, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to Authentic Living with Roxanne, creating the space for positive, healthy change. Roxanne is a keynote speaker, psychotherapist, and coach. To work with Roxanne, visit roxannedurhodge.com/blueprint. We'll see you next time on Authentic Living with Roxanne.